Wonderful. Welcome everyone to this event. Just a reminder for everyone that's not speaking to kindly keep your mics muted. My name is Eva Costas and I'm with the capacity building team at the UNFCCC. And I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this session, Rights on Fire, Integrating Human Rights and Gender Equality into Climate Action, which is a session that's led by the Raoul Wallenberg Institute under the PCCB Network. But before we kickstart, I'd like to provide you some context as to what the PCCB even is. The PCCB stands for Paris Committee on Capacity Building, and it is a constituted body under the UNFCCC that works to address gaps and needs in implementing capacity building in developing countries. And the PCCB essentially seeks to enhance capacity building efforts and enhancing the coherence and coordination of all these efforts on capacity building related to climate change. Now, the PCCB actually launched the PCCB Network a couple of years back because there were so many stakeholders that were doing some great work in capacity building. So to essentially create the platform to enable them to get together, share information, best practices, and connect with one another and essentially amplify all their capacity building related work. So as of today, the network unites over 400 organizations from 100 countries, all engaging in various aspects of capacity building related to climate action. One of the newest members of the PCCB network is the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. And of course, the network welcomes many more members, so you're actually welcome to join through the links provided over in the chat. But going back into today's topic and theme, the PCCB itself actually has human rights as well as gender as one of its key cross-cutting issues for capacity building efforts. And human rights principles ensure that vulnerable communities are empowered and protected and can participate in the decision-making process and access resources equitably. At the same time, gender equality perspectives that recognize the challenges faced by women in adaptation and mitigation efforts and really emphasize the importance of addressing gender-based disparities and promoting women's leadership and agency climate action are essential and integral to capacity building. So ensuring a human rights and gender equality approach in capacity building initiatives not only gives power and ownership to these groups, but essentially ensures that we advance in social justice and sustainable development for all. So with that, we're very pleased to for the RWI to host the session under the PCCB network, and we'll pass it over to Matthew Scott to kickstart the session. Thank you.
Great. Well, hi everybody, and thanks Eva and Isabel and the rest of the PCCB network for helping us to organize this session and for the partnership that we're developing around capacity building, human rights, disasters, and climate change. It's my great pleasure to open this event where we're talking about Rights on Fire, looking at the methodology that we've been developing at the Institute together with partners here today that seeks to facilitate the operationalization of what we see in the Paris Agreement, the ambition reflected in the preamble. And since we're convened under the PCCB network today, which is part of the UNFCCC, and the Paris Agreement is so important in this context, I thought it's good to start off just by first reading that preamble. This is what we put in the concept note for the session today, and it kicks us off. After that, I'll introduce our speakers and a little bit about RWI, and then dive into the FIRE framework itself. But why are we talking about human rights at all? I mean, there's plenty of reasons beyond the preamble itself, and people who've been working on human rights at the intersection of environment and climate change have for a long time seen this connection, but it's significant that we now have a firm foothold within the normative framework that's helping us to work towards addressing and minimizing the adverse impacts of climate change. Here in the preamble, where it states, acknowledging that climate change is a common concern of humankind, parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights, the right to health, the rights of indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, children, persons with disabilities, and people in vulnerable situations, and the right to development, as well as gender equality, empowerment of women, and intergenerational equity. So that's a great ambition reflected in the preamble. The question that arises and that we've been exploring since the adoption of the Paris Agreement is how to put that ambition into practice. And that's moving from international all the way down to local levels. So who's been doing that? Well, the Raoul Wallenberg Institute has been around since 1984, developed as an initiative of the law faculty at Lund University, and now we're an independent but affiliated institution with the law faculty. We work in multiple regions around the world, advancing understanding of and respect for human rights. Primarily working with states and academia, but also with civil society, thinking about the practical dimension. Human rights has been force in the world since at least 1948 with the adoption of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. But it means a lot of things. And so we try to make a tangible contribution to the realization of human rights in specific contexts. And in those, in that sense, we work on 4 thematic areas, of which human rights and environment is one. And within human rights and environment, we have a particular focus on climate-related human mobility, both looking at the cross-border dimension, but also the internal movement of people in the context of disasters and climate change, as well as climate adaptation more broadly. So it's within that context that we've been working with partners to figure out how to operationalize this human rights dimension of climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction. Who are those partners? Well, there are too many to name now, but we're so delighted to have 3 of them present here to join me on the panel today. First, we have Professor Tasneem Siddiqui. She is professor at the University of Dhaka and leads the Refugee and Migratory Movements Research Unit there. And we've worked in many ways together for many years, and it continues to be a pleasure and an honor. Then we have Ms. Devi Juliana from the Ministry of Law and Human Rights and the Directorate General of Human Rights there, who we're also collaborating closely with in the Indonesian context. And we look forward to hearing from her about how the Directorate General is using FIRE in practical contexts at the local level. And finally, we have Mr. Yusufu Kamara, who is the Director of Programs at the Sierra Leone Red Cross Society, joining us from Freetown, and also a great partner looking specifically at urban climate-related displacement. And he'll tell us more about how we've worked together on that. So that's quick introductions. We've only got an hour today, so the idea of the session is to give a taster of some of the ways that we've used FIRE. But in order to do that, it's important that we have some little more understanding of what FIRE is. So that's my job before I hand over then to Tasneem. And we have this structure of a kind of Q&A, but we also want to make sure there's time for the audience to pose questions that you might have. And there's a function to do that in the Q&A structure here in the platform. So please do that, and I'll monitor it while they're talking, and we can put the questions to them after some initial exchanges with me. So FIRE is an attempt to consolidate existing international standards and guidelines that are relevant to climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction. There is a volume of material to work through if responsible actors at the national or local level want to align with the preambular ambition of the Paris Agreement when taking action to address climate change, align with human rights. So we've got legal standards that have, as I said, developed over 75 years relating to the right to adequate housing, the right to health, as we saw in the preamble, the right to development, the right to food, the right to public participation, the right to life, etc. These are all consolidated in international treaties, but also in guidance developed by authoritative quasi-judicial bodies that monitor states' compliance with their commitments under those treaties. So there's a lot of material there, which we have tried to consolidate in this FIRE framework. In addition, there are rights-based standards and guidelines that take human rights principles and apply them to the emergency context, disaster risk reduction, climate adaptation context. These are guidelines developed, for instance, by the Interagency Standing Committee, which is humanitarian actors who work around the world and through their operational experience generate guidance for how to do things better, learning from things that may not have worked so well in the past or things that have worked well in the past. And these are informed by human rights standards. The sphere standards, some of you will be familiar with, this is also an operational standard that has been digested and informed the development of the FIRE framework. So FIRE was an iterative process in its development, which means that we didn't create boxes to fit standards into. There was no preconceived vision of FIRE at all. It was rather, how can we make this volume of international standards and guidelines accessible to actors at a local level who may not have the time to read through all of the sphere standards and the Interagency Standing Committee guidelines and the treaty monitoring body guidelines, etc. So we consolidated and derived from that process the 6 dimensions of what is now called the FIRE framework, which I will share a visualization of now, if I can get to it. See if that goes. And here it is, 6 dimensions and something like 30 elements that inform what those dimensions mean. You can see them on the screen, but I'll just read them out. Not all of the elements, but the 6 dimensions. And as I said, these dimensions are informed by those international standards and guidelines. I won't go in clockwise order, but I'll jump around. So we have the non-discrimination dimension, which will be familiar to most people. Those working with the Sustainable Development Goals will recognize the non-discrimination dimension reflected in the ambition of leaving no one behind. This is the idea that is arguably a principle of customary international law by this point. It's a fundamental principle that most states respect and embrace, at least in principle. So drawing attention to this dimension, which also draws attention to the intersectional quality. So we think not only about the situation of women, but the situation of women who belong to minority ethnic groups, etc. This is part of the FIRE framework from the beginning. Fundamental rights and equality, as I said in the introduction, relate to these substantive rights that are captured in international human rights treaties, like the right to life, the right to food, the right to shelter, etc. Governance systems and structures has many elements and many dimensions, as you might expect, but it's even things like budgets, as well as things like data and capacity strengthening from a human rights and gender equality perspective. I suppose here it's worth highlighting that when there is this volume, even within the consolidated version, as we can see in FIRE, what we're thinking about as the utility of the framework itself is not just to produce a beautiful diagram, but to help relevant actors to ask appropriate questions that might otherwise not be asked in the ordinary course of operational activities. So it pauses for thought to think, okay, how are we integrating this dimension? Or have we forgotten to take into account the situation of persons with disabilities in the development of our early warning system at the local level? Something like that. Participation and access to information is a fourth dimension, which are fundamental principles that are not unique to human rights, but are certainly at the core of this human rights and gender equal approach. Agency and empowerment has always been part of human rights-based approaches. But here, and together with the social norms and context dimension, these reflect more of the feminist political ecology insights that were generated through exchanges with partners on a specific program called the Building Resilience to Disaster Risk Program, which is where FIRE was officially, formally born. This was a 5-year collaboration with the Stockholm Environment Institute, the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, and the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, where we engaged in a transdisciplinary exchange, both across academic disciplines, law and feminist political ecology, as well as that operational dimension. And that agency and empowerment and social norms and context dimension of the framework really brings out that social context where we pay attention not only to formal standards and guidelines that you can see in treaties and guidance documents, but also the nitty-gritty of ground level social norms and context, history, power, and struggle. So in our interactions with different interlocutors using FIRE, we've found that these two dimensions really add a lot to the operational relevance of the framework because it calls attention to the local context and moves away or adds onto what might sometimes be seen as kind of idealized visions of how society ought to work to how things are really happening so that we can engage in real life thinking about what to do about these issues. So there's a lot more that can be said about what the framework is. You can have a look at the link that's in this visual here. RWI FIRE would probably get you there in a Google search. You can find there the consolidated international standards and guidelines themselves. It's about 30 pages worth of standards that have been consolidated into those dimensions. And there's a bunch of other material there as well, including some academic publications looking at how we've used that in a variety of contexts. Because, and this is one of the last points I'll make before handing over, because we have used FIRE in a research context, we've used it to evaluate existing legal and policy frameworks to recognize where there might be gaps. And we've also used it, and this is what we're talking about today, in the context of capacity building, or what we often refer to as co-learning exchanges, recognizing that knowledge is diverse and takes many forms. We learn from each other in the exchanges that we have. And we've done that in a lot of different contexts. As I mentioned, working with Professor Tasneem, as we were developing FIRE in the form that it takes now, we collaborated with a number of academic partners, including RAMRU, in producing a blended learning course, looking at disaster displacement in Asia Pacific. So also with partners based in Indonesia and in the Philippines and in Thailand. And this process is also how we came into collaboration with the Indonesian Ministry of Law and Human Rights, because Ms. Devi Yuliana, who'll speak, was also a participant on this blended learning course. And we'll hear from her soon once I stop talking. We've also used the FIRE framework in its pilot phase in an 8-country technical cooperation training of trainers initiative, together with the Asia Preparedness Partnership, which is part of the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, where we looked specifically at early warning, evacuation, and camp management dimensions of emergency preparedness for response, and supported civil society and local and national government actors to develop insights that they could then share more broadly at the national level. And that specifically happened in Nepal, with quite a lot of onward capacity strengthening at the local level, and some other initiatives in some of the other 8 countries. And finally, we've had this initiative with Yusufu and other colleagues in Kenya and Uganda, using FIRE to explore dimensions of displacement risk in urban contexts. So it's a versatile framework that, as I said earlier, helps us to ask relevant questions. And I think without further ado, I should start asking relevant questions, first to Ms. Tasneem Siddiqui. Tasneem, I will first invite you to reflect on this pioneering national strategy on the management of climate and disaster-induced internal displacement, which I think now has a shorter to name, the National Policy on Internal Displacement. But this is a document developed by the Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief in Bangladesh that has a specific human rights dimension. Could you tell us a little bit about your role in this process, and specifically recognizing that human rights can sometimes feel sensitive to different actors? How has the integration of a human rights perspective been received or engaged with by state actors, as well as civil society actors? So that is my question to you.
Thank you, Matthew. First of all, I would like to just thank you for inviting me to this wonderful session and share our experience in framing the national strategy on internal displacement, which is you are also part of which. So I would say in 2021, the national strategy was adopted by the government, and very quickly the government came up with an idea that we must have an action plan to follow it up. So by 2022, we already have an action plan. Again, initially we thought it will be a 5-year action plan, but the government became so enthusiastic. It's a long-term sort of action plan where there are initial sort of short-term goals, mid-term goals, and then longer-term goals. So a 20-year action plan they came up with. Now, this national strategy, if I link it with rights, human rights, then the first thing is it covers all 3 stages of displacement. It is like prevention of displacement, then protection during displacement, and most importantly, durable solution to those who have already been displaced. So in these 3 areas, the document everywhere starts with identifying all the human rights that are linked, all the rights, in fact, are linked with displaced population. So identifying the relevant rights, and then it come up with its strategies to handle the situation. So now the thing is how, this document became a right-based document. it is quite interesting that at the beginning, when we were asked to prepare this document, then we were not, we had this right-based approach in mind, but government didn't. But what we did, we asked, like, the government policy is based on a broader social framework that government has undertaken. Any program, any designing of a policy or strategy has to be under that broad social framework. So under that social framework, one of the main element is actually, age, gender, disability, all inclusive policy, their rights. And in that case, this document, when we took the principle of UN guiding principle of internal displacement, and when said that all displaced person enjoy the same right as any other person who has not been displaced to development and any other activities, or to move within the country. When you start with this as a principle, then automatically the international document is with you to make it rights based. Then again, the government is also committed to this whole Sendai framework for DRR, and it has to annually report to on its development in DRR. So it took this document as its commitment to one component of disaster risk reduction. Therefore, any reporting, it became like, it wanted to highlight its approach, right-based approach that is pursued in Sendai framework. And then, if I must say, when we first developed this document, that was in end of 2015. Gradually, it went under the carpet for 2-3 years. Then new minister came, and he, really wanted to pursue this. And accidentally, I met in 2019 Matthew, you remember, in this UNDRR program. And then I said that government have asked us to update the document. And while updating, we collaborated with the RWI in making it more right-based. So you see, stage by stage, the document became right-based, although the FIRE framework as such we didn't use, but the elements of human rights inbuilt in the document. And if you want, I can talk a little bit about sensitivity. Sensitivity, when you talk about rights, government functionaries are sensitive. But then when we put it under international standards and things of social development, then, broad framework of government, then we very nicely moved, strategically moved in a way so that gradually it is a right-based document. But initially we have talked more about broader social development goals. So that way we got them. And then we made friendship or partnership with all human rights based climate change related organizations. We made a small caucus of groups with whom we pursued the document. Then again, parliamentary standing committee we used, parliamentary caucus on climate change and migration we used. So these things provided us with everyone became part of it. And then all went through the government. The ministry asked 27 ministries to come and join when each section was being vetted. So what happened? They all became part of it. 27 ministries became part of it. So therefore, the sensitivity you could avoid, and civil society is always for rights. So they supported in pursuing this document. Thank you.
Thanks for that history and the engagement with that. I think critical point about sensitivity, and you mentioned, Tasneem, also this broader social development ambition kind of way of talking about human rights without necessarily talking about using the language of human rights. And that's something that we encountered a lot in the work that we've done. and where probably different human rights actors have different perspectives, but certainly if you see the FIRE framework as a way of asking relevant questions, to my mind, specifically insisting on human rights language is not necessarily always the best entry point. So we've had rights-based and inclusive approaches and other formulations that somehow work better in a local context, but we're doing the same thing. And I think this is partly because the dimension of human rights and gender equality goes beyond that purely legal dimension. And it addresses fundamental points relevant to human dignity that can be pursued in lots of ways, and human rights insights can contribute to that. We will come back to you, Tasneem, I think. But first, let's hear from Ms. Devi. I cannot see you, Devi, but I believe you are here with us.
Unmute yourself, Devi.
Yes, I already unmute and I already opened my video also, so
here you are.
Everyone can see. Hopefully, everyone can see me.
Yes.
Great, Devi. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
The question that I have for you relates to the work of the Directorate General of Human Rights. You were a participant on one of the blended learning courses run by RWI, where we used FIRE to look at specifically disaster displacement. But our collaboration has gone further now, and the Directorate General is using FIRE in interesting ways. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Matt. So, since we are in different times, now I'm in Papua, east side from Indonesia. Allow me to wish good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all participants. Also, I will also like to greet to our honorable speakers, Professor Tasneem Siddiq. It's nice to know you, and also Dr. Matthews Good, who my colleagues who introduced me to FIRE, and then Yusufu Safara. We will see him soon after this from Red Cross Society. And last not but least, Miss Windy, Miss Danang, both are wonderful colleagues. We have achieved many things together and we'll continue to do so in our next engagements. So first, I was enrolled into one of Raoul Wallenberg course using FIRE to address climate-related displacement, provide a comprehensive framework for understanding the intersection of human rights and climate-induced mobility. This holistic approach reshaped my perception of human rights as not merely a set of abstract principles, but as actionable guidelines that can drive effective policy solutions in the context of climate change and displacement, this is a new things for me as a person. In the basic level of this blended learning course, the course laid a strong foundation by introducing the basic principle of human rights and connecting them with the climate-related mobility context. This helped me understand the broader human rights issues that arise from climate-related displacement, such as the right to housing, education, health, and decent standard of living, among others. And following by participate in an advanced online course with the same theme, but more practical, that took us deeper into the practical application of human rights. We focus on integrating human rights into policy process through structure analysis. This stage of the course was pivotal in demonstrating how to conduct a schematic evaluation of law, regulation, and policy in identifying gaps and suggesting human rights-based improvement. The comprehensive nature of this advanced level illustrates how human rights can be integrated at multiple levels of policy and legislation, ensuring that those displaced by climate-related events receive the protection and support they need. And one of the most significant takeaways from the course was the use of fire as a framework to analyze and understand how human rights consideration can be integrated into climate-related policy. During the final project, we use fires, which has 6 dimensions to evaluate the extent to which human rights were incorporated into specific regulation. And this exercise was invaluable in illustrating the practical application on human rights principle in real scenario. So I found FIRE to be a user-friendly and highly applicable tool for conducting policy analysis. Its straightforward language and simple presentation make it accessible to a wide range of users, even those without a background in law or human rights. And this is crucial in a governmental context where staff often rotated and may lack of capacity and not have specialized training in human rights, just like Dr. Med said, reflected that no one have time to read all human rights textbook. So the simplicity of FIRE that offer helps bridge the knowledge gaps. So am I have time? Okay, so actually me as a policy analyst, I often rely on one of a tool called regulatory impact analysis called RIA, if everyone know about RIA, regulatory impact analysis. It is one of a tool as a policy analyst to evaluate laws and support the policy making process. However, RIA is a generic tool that doesn't specifically address a human rights issue. So when I found FIRE, it can providing a practical approach to incorporating human rights consideration into policy analysis and development. So in conclusion, given my role in Directorate General of Human Rights, I believe FIRE is not only useful for our internal analysis, but also hold potential for wider application. As we work to mainstream human rights across different ministry and agency, FIRE can serve as a practical tool to help familiarize stakeholders with human rights principles and support their integration into various policy areas, including those addressing climate-related displacement and mobility. Maybe that's a wrap from me. Thank you, Dr. Matt.
Thanks for that detailed engagement, Devi. And it's inspiring, at least for me, to hear the continuation of the learning that you engaged with on the blended learning course into practical contexts where you're evaluating policy or integrating these considerations in an operational context. I mentioned in my introduction that we've done that, but the whole idea of developing FIRE is that it ought not to be limited to people who have kind of professional background in human rights. Of course, at the Directorate General, David, you do, but others are also using this to, as you said, practically engage with human rights without having that specialist background. That's the aim, and it's inspiring to hear that it's being used in that way. So thank you very much. Now we move to Sierra Leone. And here we have Mr. Yusufu Kamara, introduced as the Director of Programs at the Sierra Leone Red Cross Society. Yusufu, you were one of the partners in the Climate Displacement in African Cities initiative, which was supported by the Swedish Institute and brought together local actors in Sierra Leone, Kenya, and Uganda. And it would be great to hear from you about how working with fire in that context, including in the development of the city profile for Freetown, how it informed the work and the way the Sierra Leone Red Cross Society engages with the issue of urban displacement risk. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Matthew, and thank you to colleagues, speakers. I think you have given me the foundation to just move on. Thank you, Dr. Scott, for actually talking about the 6 dimensions, because we actually use fire directly and on a slum, a case study of a slum community in Freetown. Freetown is the capital city of Sierra Leone. And around Freetown, we have 27 slums. And we took one of the biggest slums that is at the heart of Freetown called Crew Bay. And we use fire framework to analyze, to look at what is there, what is not there, and what are the challenges of the different categories of people. But in our context, for Sierra Leone, Uganda, and Kenya, we did a comparative study, and a lot of learning exchange took place. And one of the things we agreed on is that fire is a refiner. It's a refiner of death framework. Death framework is deprivation, exclusion, and vulnerability. And if you use fire, if you apply fire across different settings, you will realize that you will be handling the entire global kind of challenges that we normally face with displacement, with returnees, and other forms of human rights challenges. I'll start with the first dimension, like social norms and context. We look at the Crew Bay community, and we know that most of the people at the Crew Bay community, we are from the provinces. We had 11 years of war, and because nobody wanted to go back, and because of the challenges in the province and the provinces, and because there is no opportunity there, people wanted to stay in Freetown. And because of their economic status, they can only afford to stay in the slums, where they can easily get accommodation. So the slum become kind of overpopulated. So, and that has to do with the economic status of those, especially women. Because the Crew Bay community has more women than men. And most times when disaster happen, like 2 weeks ago, there was fire disaster at the Crew Bay community. Most of the men were not around. They have gone out to seek for livelihood, while the women were at home, looking at the family, taking care of the children. Their extraordinary roles. The extraordinary role of women sometimes expose them to risk and to so many other challenges. And because they have a low socioeconomic status, high literacy rate, did not have access to financial resources, sometimes they are at more, they are at economic and social risk. And also in terms of discrimination, we applied the next dimension, which is the non-discrimination. Our constitution, our 1991 constitution, section 27 says that there should not be any discrimination against any citizen. But that is not the case. And sometimes when displacement happens, you see practically some level of discrimination. And if you go to the agency and empowerment, you realize that most of the agencies like the Sierra Leone Red Cross, IOM, the ministries, department and agencies, we're all working in consortium to support. And one of our roles as Red Cross is to support with evacuation and shelter. So for us, the fire framework came at the right time, and it shapes the development of our 5-year strategic plan. And the fire framework is part of our strategic focus area 3 under migration and shelter. So that is one of the greatest things that we learned from the fire framework. And we are presently implementing some of the components from that. And also the fundamental rights. In our case study, we found out that the former government constructed a place for the slum community. They wanted to move the slum community, but they did not look at the other rights. They don't look at the right to education, right to health, right to other basic needs. There is no electricity. So the people said they are not going, because these are rights that they should have considered. And people are saying, how can we get there? There is no electricity. There is no school. How can we get our children to school? There is no market. How can we sell our wares? Because most of the women in those in the slums are kind of petty traders. So they are staying in the slum, and the only source of livelihood to them is petty trading. So, and the government wanted to move them to about 6 miles from the center of the town. So they also disagreed with evacuation because they think that their livelihood is threatened. And we also applied participation and access to justice. And in our case study with a Freetown kind of profile, and one of the things we find out is that the government has done a lot. The government has established a legal board, which is a free service to vulnerable people. But the people in the slum don't have access to the legal board. So what they use is the informal justice system, like the chief's court, that's the traditional leaders' court, and sometimes they use paralegals, which sometimes are not really helpful, very much helpful. And we also look at the government systems and structures. We look at the legal and policy framework. And in our context, Sierra Leone, we have developed a lot of documents. We have developed the National Action Plan. We have developed the National Strategy Action Plan. But all of these plans are kind of on the shelves. They are yet to be kind of implemented. And very few people like CSOs and communities, very few people know about some of these plans. So that is a gap that will also kind of observe in our case story with the Freetown city profile. We also look at the budget capacity and resources. And the government of Sierra Leone has established a climate financing unit under the Ministry of Finance. But there is still need for the technical capacity to mobilize resources in that unit. And there is still need to have a budget line in our national kind of budget for climate change and displacement. So all of these dimensions help us in terms of developing our city profile across the 3 countries. For Sierra Leone and for the Sierra Leone Red Cross, like I said, we use the fire framework to kind of align our strategic plan for 2023 to 2027. And we have also started a lot of engagement. We are part of the Trafficking in Persons Steering Committee nationally. We are also part of the technical working group for returnee reintegration, which IOM is supporting. We are also part of the National Disaster Management Agency. These bodies are very critical in terms of displacement, evacuation, and other forms of support. So what we do presently with the FIRE framework is to get CSOs and other partners, both national and international partners, to know what is in the FIRE framework and how different organizations can use FIRE framework to strengthen their approaches. For example, I'm presently attending a workshop in Freetown, and I'm kind of doing this presentation from the training hall, at the side of the training hall. And yesterday, while we are asked, what is your expectation? My first expectation that I brought out was that how can you use FIRE framework in returnee reintegration? So because I wanted them, but we have about 32 partners in the house, including government agencies. And we have the head of Ministry of Internal Affairs that is directly in charge of displacement. And it is under the Internal Affairs that the Freetown City Council operates. So it's very key in terms of the implementation of our recommendations in the city profile. So they gave me the forum, and I was able to introduce the FIRE framework and also talked about the Freetown city profile that we have jointly developed, and also talk about some of the action plan we have identified and where partners can also come into to support. So that is how we use the FIRE framework, looking at the different dimensions, and also that is how we are using FIRE framework to shape our work in Sierra Leone.
Thanks for that tour, Yusufu. It's a great introduction to what Sierra Leone is doing, and I think it was great to hear you describing the planned relocation dimension, because this it's a specific example from Freetown, but we see it all around the world where multiple human rights dimensions are not taken into consideration. Even if there's a tension between the duty to protect life and the right to freedom of movement and so on, there might be needs to help people to move, but there are certainly human rights dimensions that need to be taken into consideration. And I think FIRE can play a helpful role there, not least because it also integrates those standards that have been developed on human mobility, including the guidance on planned relocations developed by UNHCR, Brookings, and Georgetown University. Now, time has really flown. There are questions. And I think what I might do to abuse my position as the chair, as well as a panelist, is to mention two of them and answer one of them. We have three, and we have 3 minutes, which will include a closing. So it may do a disservice to everyone that time has disappeared, but these are our constraints. Now, we have a very good question about integrating the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment into the fundamental rights and equality dimension. It's there because the list that's reflected in the visualization that I showed when I was talking doesn't list all of the substantive rights, but I think there's a lot of work that could be done conceptually as well as operationally in thinking specifically about FIRE and the right to a healthy environment. So I'm grateful for that being raised specifically, and I think there's more that we can discuss, and time won't let us do that today, but it's a fabulous and relevant observation. There's another point here about people who move maybe not recognizing the influence of climate change in their mobility. and how can these cases be recognized? Now, I can interpret this as relating maybe to a cross-border dimension of human mobility and the climate dimension for maybe climate refugees. I hope that I'm not wrong in that interpretation, but there is a lot of development happening in this case. Both internal mobility as well as cross-border and the legal dimensions and recognition of climate-related human mobility in law and practice. Currently collaborating with Earth Refuge and the Global Strategic Litigation Council for Refugee Rights, we're trying to compile existing cases so that resource will be accessible for practitioners as well as decision makers to improve the way that we think about these issues and apply the existing law and gradually develop it. The final question, and I said I would give the floor, but the time evades us, was a useful and timely pushback to something that I said about whether we necessarily have to always use human rights language. And this goes right to the heart of that sensitivity question. And as I said, recognizing in that discussion that different actors will have different perspectives, I think it's also worth saying that different contexts will require different kinds of language. And so that means if we're speaking with disaster risk management engineers, the language of accountability and liability and violation isn't necessarily the most productive. And this is where FIRE comes in as a tool, because it helps us to ask relevant questions. One of the relevant questions is certainly accountability, and you can see that in the governance systems and structures dimension, but it's not the only part. And that also helps us to recognize that human rights itself is not only about accountability. It absolutely is about accountability, and there are specific actors who can do that and are doing that very well. But there's a lot more to the story that human rights can contribute to sustainable development, disaster risk reduction, climate adaptation, that needs to fit in existing institutional, cultural, and practical contexts. Some could see that as a trade-off, but I think it's a practical utility in a climate emergency. People speak different languages, and we need to find the things that work in context. I would have loved to continue this conversation, but we've come to an end and we've even extended. I want to say thank you so much to all of the panelists, first of all, for the ongoing partnership and for participating today. Thanks to Eva and Isabel and the rest of the PCCB network, to my colleagues at RWI who are here but not visible. It's really thanks to them that we've managed to do so much with the FIRE framework. I also see others in the room who we've worked with, and I'm happy to see them present as well as others who we haven't yet worked with, but look forward to doing so. So please get in touch, and we're always happy to discuss these issues and look for ways to collaborate. As far as I can see, that's the end of our session. I'll hand it back to Eva in case there's any final points that I've failed to address, but thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Scott, maybe I want to share something that we also want to say that we are proud to share one of our best practice regarding our new guidelines concerning mainstreaming human rights based approach into the law and policy. And these new guidelines, we also adopt FIRE, and in the main tool is we adopt the general comment, which is stated in the Covenants of Civil and Political Rights, as well as in the Covenant Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is FIRE also adopt these covenants. So we proud to say that we have this new guideline, and it includes FIRE also in that. And also Indonesia now we enforce business sector to respect human rights with concrete action to protect the adverse impact of operational business that lead to environmental pollution through Presidential Regulation number 60 2023 concerning national strategy on business and human rights. So we have so many regulations. So in conclusion, we hope in this panel discussion we can share and exploring possible cooperation and networking among practitioners, government officials, and civil society in the future time. I hope we can collaborate in the future. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Devi, for that. And a last point, these kind of resources, we might also start to think about whether we can feature some of them on the FIRE page, which I've shared, because it is encouraging to see how it's being used in different contexts, and that could be a useful resource and point of connection. So thanks once again. I think our meeting is closed.